So I'll start things off today. Um, First of all, welcome to our webinar series. My name is Krista Ross. I'm CEO here at the Fredericton Chamber of Commerce. And we also have Tanya, Christine, and Morgan that work with the Chamber on the call as well. And today we're going to be recording this, so we will have the link shared to our social media and posted on our website afterwards. So if you do find that this is something you want to review after the fact or share with some of your colleagues, please feel free to take that link and share it. And today, we're going to be talking about market research. So Porter O'Brien is a chamber member company, and they're a Fredericton-based communications agency. Partners are Tim Porter and Jordan O'Brien. They have a combined 50 years of experience in public relations, strategy, marketing, government relations, market research, and media training. So that means they started when they were approximately 14 years of age. The webinar today, now this says it's Media Relations 101. I thought we were doing market research.
Market research today. Old script, Krista, sorry.
Yeah, sorry about that. So today we're talking about market research. They're going to fill us in on all. Sorry about that, folks. That's I had the wrong piece of paper in front of me, but at least I knew that it was about market research because I'm quite excited. We're actually doing our chamber survey quite soon, so we're hoping to get some helpful tips on how we can do that research in an effective and efficient way. And I know that there's a couple of people on the call today that are specifically interested in market research. So a lot of us have heard of public opinion polls, but those are just one of the many market research tools that we can use, understanding our market, understanding our clients, and even to get some input and insight on the reputation that we have in our own community. So I know that both Tim and Jordan have done a lot of work in market research for many years. They're going to talk to us about what they call the art and the science of what might seem mysterious to many of us. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass the microphone over to Tim and to Jordan and look forward to hearing your presentation. And as I mentioned, don't forget to put questions in the chat and we'll get to those at the end.
Thank you very much, Krista. Appreciate that. So as Krista said, we're a strategy and public relations company here in downtown Fredericton, and I am the only 50-year-old with the company. I'm surrounded with by 30-year-olds, which I love. Jordan and I have been working together for, I don't know, 10, 12 years, Jordan, something like that. So we have talked about some of these categories that we work in before. As Krista referenced, we've talked about media training with this group, I believe. And we do quite a bit of work in the government affairs and marketing realm. But in one of our other major categories today is market research, which is definitely an area that we operate in and we want to focus on. Jordan, I think you're flipping the slides. So I think your next one is an agenda. So the agenda basically gives us some topics here. As Krista said, a lot of us are very familiar with polling, but there are other elements to this category. Jordan, do you want to touch on some of those items in the agenda before we do a deep dive?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And the market research bucket is really how you understand your market through research. So now that you've heard that insightful piece of opening. So there's kind of two types broadly. So, and this is get a little scientific, but qualitative and quantitative. So qualitative being things you describe the qualities of, and quantitative being things you can actually count and quantify. So opinion polling is an example of quantitative. So you actually talk to a certain number of people and ask them particular questions and they give you particular answers. Customer surveys are the same. And
why don't we flip the slide, Jordan, because you're right into the
fair enough.
Here.
So and then a qualitative is when it's a little bit more subjective. So you have a discussion, you review literature, you interview people, and then you try to draw conclusions from that. And all these types of research are fall into the market research bucket, and there's an industry association that we're a member of, which is the Marketing Research and Intelligence Association of Canada. And so they kind of govern best practices. There's a lot of codes of ethics and so forth in this type of research to make sure, particularly in the opinion polling sphere, that you're protecting people's identities. It's meant to be anonymous and rolled up into buckets. So we'll talk about all of these different types of tools as we go on.
So Jordan, a lot of us have been called on the phone or prompted on Facebook or social media to participate in polls, but who are the people that are commissioning these polls? So sometimes it's not overly evident who these people are that are asking us for our opinion.
Yeah, that's a great question, Tim, and it's interesting because we see a lot of coverage of opinion polls in the media, and that represents a very small amount of the polling that actually goes on. And so the polling that you see in the news media generally is either been commissioned by the media themselves, been commissioned just as the pollster doesn't actually have a client. They're doing it as an opportunity to get their name out in the media and get people to hear about them. Or occasionally it's a third party who is trying to sway public opinion and thinking that there's a little bit of a lemming effect. And, if you find out that 70% of people think a certain way and you're not among those 70%, you might scratch your head and think, well, why am I offside? But that, I would guess, is less than 10%, maybe a lot less than 10% of the polling that actually goes on. Most of the polling is done for people's internal purposes for strategy, and we would think about it a lot from a political perspective. So political parties and governments do a lot of polling to try to understand what types of policies and initiatives would be popular, and or how to best position those issues to make them seem popular. But again, that's not the majority of opinion polling. Most opinion polling is done by business and to a lesser extent, but also a large extent to, industry groups and non-government organizations, those sorts of people who want to understand issues in order to be able to market the issues in the right way. So for example, I'd be curious to see the results, but Coca-Cola would likely have done a lot of polling about New Coke and Coca-Cola Classic and that whole era in the 80s.
A lot of consumer
a lot of consumer research, huge amounts of consumer research for sure. That's the main use of opinion polling. I would guess you're well into the 60 to 70% of all opinion polling is done for businesses with a product. Mostly a product, maybe to some extent a service, but mostly a product to sell and wanting to understand the marketplace.
So is polling accessible to the little guy if they want to find out a little bit about how their consumers think?
Yeah, absolutely. We don't actually do the mechanical part of the polling ourselves at Porter O'Brien. But we do work with partners that do some of that. We do the front end and the back end of it. And so I'll just go over this slide slightly because the last two bullets in particular answer that question, Tim. And so it's a random sample of the general population. So that's what makes it statistically representative. There's a lot of people will get confused by the notion of you get a sample size of 1,000 people in New Brunswick, maybe that's okay. But if you get a sample size of 1,000 people in the United States, where there's 300 million people, is that enough people to get a representative sample? And the answer is yes. And the analogy I once heard, which I thought was quite interesting, is if you have a bathtub full of water and you dump some salt in one corner of the water, if you pull a thimble out in the wrong spot, it might not be representative, but if you pull out a bucket, you probably will. And whether that's a swimming pool or a bathtub, a bucket is probably going to give you a pretty good sample. And so that's the formula that determines margin of error, which is how accurate the poll is. The size of the population you're trying to measure is not a variable in that formula, which is counterintuitive to a lot of people. But to answer Tim's main question, there's three general types of ways to poll, and they're a variety of quality and a variety of cost levels. But live callers is still kind of considered the gold standard in polling, although that is starting to change as fewer people answer their phones. Certainly a live caller needs to include cell phones if it's going to be the gold standard, but it's also the most expensive. You've got to pay human beings in a call center. You've got to train them. You've got to pay for the infrastructure of that call center. And then you've got to call quite a few people, many orders of magnitude more than the number you're going to speak to actually get them to go through an interview. Many people don't answer. If they do answer, they hang up before the survey is completed. On the other end of the spectrum is what's called IVR, which is interactive voice. I don't know what the R stands for. But that's but more generally called a robo-poll. Those are quite cheap. That's when you answer the phone and there's a 5-second pause and then a recorded voice asks you to press 1 for yes and 2 for no, and 1 for you make $50,000 or less a year, and 2 for you make 50 to 100, etc. And then there's online polling, which I'm sure most people have received invitations to participate in online polling. It's more likely to get a random sample theoretically than live caller, but it's how do you find the email addresses and how do you make sure that those are representative of people, and how do you allow for different types of people that are, everybody's almost as likely to answer the phone, but different types of people are more likely to complete an online survey. To get it representative is tricky. So those have various cost points. And then to really get to the crux of Tim's question, which is somewhat related to that, it's commission versus question purchase. So if you want to go out and run a full-throated survey for yourself, we could help you with that, but you're looking in the 5-figure range, even for a pretty small basic survey if it's live caller. Probably in that neighborhood if it's online. You could do it a bit cheaper if it's a robocall, but the quality will suffer. But what is accessible to smaller businesses, as Tim was getting at, is a question purchase. So there's a lot of different pollsters that we work with, and we can design the questions and we can liaise with the call centers and deliver a reporting to you and analysis. And we have statisticians we work with that help us with some of that analysis. But question purchase is very inexpensive. It's sometimes as cheap as $600 a question. And so somebody's running a poll of their own, they're bearing most of that $20,000 or so cost, which is roughly what a live caller poll will cost you. But they're saying, okay, well, there's room in this poll for 20 questions. I only need 14. So I'm going to sell 6 questions off to people and recover some of my cost. So if you're a smaller enterprise that's looking for some information, but you don't have $10,000 or $20,000 to spend, you can for 600. That'd be for online. Maybe you're looking at closer to 1,000 for a better quality poll plus the analysis. But you could get a lot of information for in the range of $1,000 to $1,500 to answer your question in a very long-winded way, Tim.
Okay, so if we go back up a slide, Jordan, and we probably should move into qualitative, and the first item being focus groups. Now, I participated in or conducted, I guess, some focus groups in the past, where we have a work in policy development, and you might have a policy that you want to find different sets of people that would have different sets of opinions, and you'd like to listen and take notes and have a little bit of a deeper understanding of how people feel about a given policy, or I guess it could be a product that you're launching. So Jordan, why don't you tell us a little bit about the advent of focus groups and why you'd convene one?
Yeah, so I mean, all 4 of these types of surveys that are mentioned on this slide have different use cases. None of these is the right solution all of the time. Often you might want to use them in combination. And focus groups are very interesting You have to be very careful with focus groups. You want to make sure that you have a very high quality facilitator in a focus group, because it's very easy for these things to bias themselves without a very strong facilitator. But what a focus group is you get a random group of people, usually about 10, maybe a little less than that. You wouldn't want much more. And you get them together into a room, or more recently, a video call, and you have a discussion about particular issues, particular products, and you try to figure out how people react and how different types of people react. You would rarely do one focus group. You would usually do several, just to make sure that maybe if there's one strong-willed person in a group that tries to take over the conversation, which is something you can mitigate with a good facilitator, but just to make sure that you're getting similar conclusions in different groups, so that you're not just getting one weird outlier group. Sometimes you might want to see, well, how do women react differently than men? How do older people react differently than younger people? So you might not have all the focus groups have the same demographic makeup. And you just have a conversation with them. You usually start off with a little bit of information, just because many people just get a little bit of information when they hear about something. So you have a conversation and see what their initial kind of first reaction is to a sentence. And then you might show them the product. You might show them a television commercial. You might show them all kinds of different things. And you have a conversation about that. And then you try to glean from that, okay, this really resonated with people, this didn't. And you try that with different groups. And then you can try to figure out how your product will sell or not sell. And you'll often
So a lot of times you see that in political campaigns where you convene a focus group to look at the particular advertising that you might be developing on a political candidate or such, or even we hear about it focus testing in movies when they're trying to figure out the ending, whether they want the couple to break up or they want them to run away in love, try to figure out the ending.
Yeah, that's right, Tim. And another one where focus groups were really kind of initially invented, it's really around product marketing.
Yeah.
And you'll often see and I've actually been in focus groups as a participant, where maybe McCain Foods or somebody like that is going to launch a new kind of French fry, and they have 3 different types of packaging and 3 different possible names for the product. And they try to see, how people react to it. So it can be used for a lot of different purposes.
So it's actually a nice little tool that is in addition to the polling. So it gives you a little more insight to why people are thinking, not just what they're thinking, but why they're thinking, I guess.
Yeah, and I think, Tim, if money was no object, and or money was less important than the best product, you would usually use at least 3, if not all 4 of these tools when you were doing something big, and perhaps use some of them more than once. Like, I find the most effective use of focus groups is to do opinion polling before and after the focus group, so that you go into the focus group with some information, and then you can go back to the general public and test the conclusions that you came out of the focus groups with. That's not necessary, but that's kind of the real gold standard of it.
Okay, so we probably, I'm assuming we have a half an hour here, so maybe we should move on to the 4th category, just the market survey, market study segment.
Yeah, so this one's is a little bit less interactive with people. It's more kind of secondary research. So you might have, not entirely secondary research, but you might have something that's been studied or researched before. So maybe you can't afford a full-blown public opinion research product, but maybe nobody's looked into this in New Brunswick before, but they've looked into it in Nova Scotia. Maybe they've looked into it in South Dakota. Maybe they've looked into it in Saskatchewan. And you can grab other people's research, go through those, try to figure out the trends, try to figure out what's in common. So if people in those 3 jurisdictions, and I just kind of picked them as relatively similar scope and scale in New Brunswick, but all came to have generally the same opinion on something, then probably New Brunswickers do as well. You can also look at all kinds of other things, literature reviews, academic studies. You can look at media reports. You can look at annual reports from publicly traded companies. You can look at Statistics Canada data, and you can look at all these different pieces of information, and you can learn a lot about the marketplace and who the players are in the market, what they're selling. You can even sometimes find out what they're paying people, etc. So this is something that you will often do for somebody as well when they're trying to understand an issue where the information all exists in the public domain, but it's sprinkled through 20 or 30 different sources.
So it's basically just doing your research and trying to collect up as much evidence as you can before you launch a project.
Correct, correct. One client that we did this for, it was really, they were thinking about whether or not to expand into Atlantic Canada, and they wanted to understand, what kind of competition they would face, whether or not the services they were thinking to bring were already being offered or not, whether or not those were considered to be good quality services. And we did this mostly through literature review, but we also interviewed a few dozen people that consume the services that this company was going to be offering, just to see whether they were satisfied with the current offerings and that sort of thing.
So I know we've even done this ourselves when we're looking at, launching different services, and you kind of have to take a little bit of look into the marketplace and see who else is offering such a service, and whether you want to be involved in that competitive field, whether you feel you can be involved, you can be competitive, or whether you want to perhaps just procure those services from others in the marketplace and concentrate on something else.
Yep, that's bang on.
Yeah. Okay, so do we want to just open it up for questions?
Well, right before we jump to questions, Tim, I think we didn't really talk about kind of segment surveys, customer surveys, which I think might be relevant to a lot of chamber members. So I'm just going to flip back to that slide.
Okay.
And this is the same idea as a public opinion poll, but it's not for the general public. It's for a group of specific people. So if you want to know what your customers think about an issue, paying a polling firm to call 500 random people is not the right answer. You want to talk to your actual customers. And so you can do this a lot of ways. You might have a loyalty program where you have people's information, or you can do it at the store. Like a lot of people do this is at purchase. You ask people to complete a survey, whether that's an online purchase or in store.
Or afterwards when you get home. Yeah,
exactly. And if it's a service in particular, you might send a survey along with the bill. And these are helpful for a variety of reasons, but a lot of them are if you have a good strategic plan for your business, and we've talked about strategic planning on this webinar series before. A good strategic plan has really clear measurements to see whether or not you're delivering on your strategic plan. And if you're in the service industry, one of those measurements has to be customer satisfaction. And you can measure customer satisfaction indirectly, like what's the trend line of your sales, what's your number of repeat customers. But a really good way to measure that is through regular customer surveys, whether you do it twice a year or once a quarter, once a year. It's really important to be able to see whether or not your customers are happy, because if they're not, you're probably not going to be in business for very long.
Understanding your customer, I guess, is key, and this would be one tool. And we're in an age now when we're collecting up a lot of information about our customers, either one way or another, either through social media, I guess, or even we've seen some of this debate with the COVID information that's being collected of customers. So it is an age where I guess we're paying much closer attention to who our customers are.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I'm sorry to cut you off there, Tim, but now I would say we're ready for questions.
Yeah, is it a half hour that we have?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you very much. That was really informative. And I am going to go to the chat and start taking questions that are there, but I have a couple of my own first, if you don't mind. Um, how do you determine who should be in a focus group? And should it be small, large? Like, how's the best way for that to work? And should people hear each other's conversations?
I think, the ones I participated in, as Jordan said, usually there were maybe 6 to 10. I would say 12 would be a large number. But what usually a company would do is they pay people about $50 or so to come in on an evening for maybe 3 hours and have a presentation. And then they collect the feedback, and usually the client could be present. Maybe they're behind a two-way mirror sometimes, and you can watch and listen to people. But there would be multiple, usually focus groups. So there would be 6 to 12 people in one evening, and they may constitute. Maybe you're looking at something from a French and an English point of view. So you would have one focus group being entirely in French, or another one in English, or depending on what your issue is. But yeah, and there could be a number of them. So and then do different locations. So in this province, you might do one in Fredericton, Moncton, St. John, to see if there's any different regional perspectives on the issue that you're trying to look at.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Tim, traditionally focus groups are always in person. And COVID, as it has with everything else, it's accelerated this move towards more virtual things. And there was some of that happening already. I've seen a few online focus groups probably beginning the last 5 years or so. And the advantage of those is, as Tim says, usually it's quite costly. If you want to do a good focus group, particularly in New Brunswick, you might want to do it in at least 5 different locations, right? Because you want the 3 cities, but you may also want a rural English and a rural French perspective. And, and you probably want to do 2 groups in each. So all of a sudden you're doing 10 groups, and that's very expensive. So the nice thing about doing them online is the geographic factor can be removed. Um, but in terms of the who, it would depend on what you're looking to sell, Krista. So if government's doing it, it's probably meant to be a representative sample of the entire public population. But if you're in the commercial business, who who your audience is. So if it's Robert Simmons doing it, they're probably going to have mostly men. If it's
Age range.
yeah, I was going to say if it's
Robert Simmons has a huge ladies' wear department. I'm just going to let you know.
well, look, it's a bad example. Okay, I don't know what to say. But you know what I mean. There would be,
Yes,
and,
yes.
and Tim's bang on about age, right? So there a lot of marketing, like mass marketing, like your Coca-Cola and your Reebok and these types of people. They just focus on this 25 to 49 demographic because those are the consumers that spend the most of their money, and they just figure everybody else can come along to get along, and they focus very much on that demographic. And there'd be different reasons to focus on different demographics. So part of it would tie back to what your growth plan is. What segment of society are you trying to reach? And that might be everybody, or it might be a certain demographic.
I have another question. If you're doing a survey, do you find that open-ended questions or yes or no or ranking, like what do you find gives you the most genuine or accurate data?
That's a complicated question. So I'm a big fan of close-ended questions, as they're called. So you have to choose your answer from among, the options, and it's often I'm also a big fan of the agree disagree scale. So do you agree or disagree? And your choices are strongly agree, somewhat disagree, strongly disagree. Because that's very quantitative, right? And so an opinion poll is supposed to be quantitative. So when you get into open-ended questions, you're kind of blurring the line between quantitative and qualitative, right? And I had a fascinating conversation years ago with a public and opinion researcher about the difference between jobs, the economy, and employment. So if you ask somebody, what is the top issue facing Canada today? And you don't give them options, an open-ended question, you're going to get all kinds of answers. And so to make that data meaningful, you have to group those answers together, right? If I say deficit and you say debt, well, that probably means the same thing. So you don't want to have, you know, one person said deficit and one person said debt. You want to say two people said deficit or debt. So when you try to group those open-ended answers together, it can become very subjective. And so I had this researcher describe to me about the psychology behind somebody that's talking about jobs as the number one issue versus employment or unemployment as the number one issue. They could be coming at it from a completely different perspective. And so you can't, if you group those things together, you might be missing something. And so the challenge with open-ended questions is that after the fact, when you no longer have the person on the phone, you have to try to figure out what they meant in order to group like-minded, like things together. Whereas if it's close-ended and you just said, okay, here are the 6 issues, pick one, then you know that that's what the person meant, as opposed to the subjectiveness that might get interjected if it's open-ended.
It kind of reminds me, Krista, of referendum questions we used to try to craft. And if you wanted to win your referendum, you would keep it open-ended because people would vote for it because they weren't exactly sure what they were voting for. They just kind of knew they kind of supported the subject, so they would go for it. But if you were very specific, then they had a reason maybe to vote against it.
Okay. Yeah, I guess sometimes it concerns me if you have a close-ended question that you answer the question for them. So if you say, here are 4 things, you know, do you think they're important, or rank them? Maybe there was another thing that is really important, but we're going to miss it because we've given them 4 options. We've said, here are the 4 priorities we're looking at. Do you agree or disagree?
Well, and maybe that's more helpful if you're looking at policy ideas and you're looking kind of everything's on the table.
Yeah.
But I would say though, Krista, you hit on something that I wanted to address earlier. So thank you for keeping me on my own track here. And that's how important question design is.
Mm-hmm.
And I love public opinion research because I'm a nerd, and like I do a lot of online surveys just because it amuses me. And it is terrifying how often these surveys are just terribly written, with leading questions, double-barreled questions. And it's not, I don't think there's malice. It's just people haven't been trained in question design. But it's as simple as a normal person would ask a question, oh, do you support this? That's a terrible way to ask a question in a survey. You have to say, do you support or oppose this? Because if you just say, if you support this, you're pointing to them that they're offside if they don't support it. Like, right, you know what I mean? So you're going to make sure that the question is designed in such a way that doesn't lead anybody and it doesn't confuse anybody, because that's what they call a double-barreled question, where you're asking one question, but you're sort of asking two. You know what I mean? Where you would say, you know, some people are concerned about traffic congestion and other people are concerned about red light cameras. So do you think we should have red light cameras? And you see questions like that all the time.
Well, but sometimes the leading is also intentional, Jordan.
Correct. It can be on purpose, because other times, so if you're designing a poll, and this becomes a PR tactic as opposed to a public opinion research tactic, because you can use different tools for different purposes, right? But if you're conducting a poll because you want to influence public discourse, and so your plan is to release that poll to the media, well, then you might frame your questions in a leading way to get the answers that you want. And there'd be other reasons for that as well. Maybe you're trying to convince your board to go in a direction, and you want to make sure that your data backs up your recommendation. And that we wouldn't recommend doing that necessarily, but but even if there is no malice or intent, bad survey design, and you see this a lot when governments do like Survey Monkey type surveys and this sort of thing. And there's no bad intentions at all. It's just somebody says, oh, let's do a survey on this. And then a person who has no training in survey design and question design does their best. But you really need somebody that has training in that.
So there's a question in the chat that says, would market studies often be step one in a process before doing one of the other three options, i.e. to generally understand the space before seeking more specific information through one of the other avenues discussed?
Maybe.
I would say, yeah.
Often, it would probably be first if you were doing multiple tools, but there's people that would just do a market study and that would be sufficient information for them. Market studies can be pretty comprehensive. But as I mentioned before, all of these tools have value, and often they have value in concert. So in fact, we're working on a proposal with somebody that we're hoping to do some work with, and we would do all four, and some of them more than once. And it's never going to be the same solution twice, really, because every situation is unique. But sometimes the market study would go first, but it wouldn't always. So for example,
it depends on where you're starting from.
Yeah, exactly. So for example, you might not know what part of the market you want to study. And so you might need to do an opinion poll to figure out, where is the volatility or the growth potential or the most interest in a particular market, and then study that market as opposed to having to study a larger marketplace. Other times the market study would come first. It really depends on what you're trying to solve for.
Recently, the Atlantic Chamber of Commerce came out with a new process. They're calling it Atlantic Impressions, and they're asking people to join this group, and then they will do quick 1 or 2 question surveys from time to time, or opinion surveys and polls, and then shoot those out as to the media and so on. What do you think of that type of regular thing where you actually have a group versus it being a little more broad on a regular basis?
So that would fall under the category we would call a segment survey. So I assume that they're drawing from chamber members. So the CFIB does this a lot. You see them do it all the time, and they're in the media a lot from it, where they survey their members very regularly. And that's not a bad tool. You got to be very careful when you design those sorts of things to make sure, even if you're only trying to speak to the membership of Atlantic Chambers, that it's a representative look into those chambers, right? And so it's you got to be very careful when you ask people to join in a very broad way, right? And because certain people are more likely to opt in to certain things, whereas you really need to be very proactive if you want to get a representative group and call everybody and say, listen, we'd really like you to join this. Your information is needed and it's valued, and yada, 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 or you might get a certain type of people. But once you get the right panel to draw from, I think that's great. It's a really good tool to get real quick information that is representative. But the real important part at the beginning is to make sure that the group is representative of whomever it is they're supposed to represent.
There's no other questions in the chat. Does anybody on the call have a question that they would like to pose? Everybody's pretty quiet. We're actually in the midst of developing our annual advocacy and communications survey. So maybe just for fun, we'll send it over to you once we have our questions finalized to see what you think of that. And we're actually, Morgan's taken a few courses in designing of questions and surveys and how to do that sort of thing, StatsCan programs and whatnot. But we also generally get our board to review surveys just to make sure that sometimes when you're very close to something, you ask it in a certain way, which, as you say, might lead or guide the answer. So when we get our board to have a look at those, sometimes they might have a different perspective, but it would be great if you guys could look at that as well. And then folks on this call, when you get that survey in the next couple of weeks, make sure you fill it out, because we really do need and value the opinions of our members, because it helps guide our policy processes. So the answer to that question is yes, we'd love to have a look at your survey.
Oh, of course. Absolutely. No question at all. Send it over.
All right. So are there any other questions that anybody would like to pose at this time? This is your chance. Look, this has been very informative, very helpful. And I know that our members found this to be, very useful in terms of how they're going to ask questions and survey and get information from, whether it be their clients, their potential clients, the community. For us, it's membership. And I know we're going to be using some of the information we learned today in processing our questions. So thank you very much. Really appreciate Porter O'Brien and the work that you guys are doing and the support that you've lent the Chamber. So we thank everybody for your attendance today, and remember that it's recorded and we'll be sharing it on our social media. If you want to share it on yours or have another look, get some reminders of what you learned today. So thanks, Tim. Thanks, Jordan. And we'll see everybody again soon.
Thanks for having us, Krista.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.